Great. Thank you so much, Corinne. And thank you to everyone for taking time to join this session this afternoon. Really appreciate that. We know that it's a busy time of year, both in terms of the admissions and financial aid calendar as well as the holiday calendar. So we hope that you will find this time well spent. For those of you I have not yet had a chance to get to know, my name is Mark Mitchell. I'm Vice President for SSS by NAIS. And one of my main jobs at SSS is to help provide professional development, research, training, workshops, conferences, et cetera, specifically for managing financial aid programs at independent schools. Our SSS service provides financial aid analysis and need analysis resources to over 2,100 schools around the country. So it's my great pleasure to be able to share with you a little bit of what we learn from that vantage point about what are some of the key trends in financial aid and that are impacting how schools can use their affordability initiatives to help make sure that they stay as fully enrolled as possible with all the right kinds of kids that help the school meet its mission. So again, it's my pleasure to be part of this conversation today. I will go through the slides that I have here, as Corinne mentioned, and then at the end, we will certainly open up for some time to answer questions or take any additional comments or feedback that you might want to offer through the Q&A component of the GoToWebinar box. So let me go ahead and get started here. So I kind of approached this topic in three basic chunks. One is that the first one where I'll look at some of the trends in the evolving applicant pool and what some of those implications are for schools and school leaders as we look at the changes in who's applying for financial aid and what are the dynamics that are causing us to see some of those changes and what we can start to do to be better prepared for them. And then in the second part of the presentation, I'll talk about pricing, enrollment, and financial aid demand trends that we see, particularly using a lot of the data that comes from the NAIS Data Analysis for School Leaders program, otherwise known as DAZZLE, formerly our Stats Online program. There's a lot of really interesting observations that can be made about how, before the recession kicked in, what were some of the trends in tuition change, enrollment growth, and financial aid demand, and how those compare to the last couple of years, last few years since the recession. And there are some interesting learning points from looking at those trends in that way that will then lead us to the types of things that I believe that schools should be asking themselves from a strategic posture in terms of what kind of strategic questions and action steps you can be engaged in order to develop and design solutions and new ideas for dealing with the challenges that these trends are putting in front of us. So hopefully, and I'll be able to cover those three chunks in about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for a question and answer. So the first thing we want to look at really are the trends in the applicant pool and how it's evolving. This cartoon just kind of cracks me up because I think as the responsibility for admissions and financial aid directors to really review financial aid applications, financial aid materials based on what families are sending in to help them be able to meet the tuition costs. It really is important that financial aid professionals really know who their audience is, who's applying, why are they applying, what are their needs, how can we help them better, how can we be better at evaluating some of the materials that come through to make sure that our limited dollars are going to the right people in the right way. And so it is important for us to be equipped not just with the day-to-day skills and the know-how, but also to have a broad view of what are the trend lines and who's applying and what are some of the dynamics that are impacting that. So this next few slides, we're really just going to focus on that, the trends and the evolving applicant pool. This slide here shows some data about how our applicant pool has been evolving. And this data all comes from our SSS by NAIS filer pool. So for these selected years, we've kind of studied who's sending an application to us through our parents' financial statement. And if we break it down by income ranges, it's interesting to see how the applicant pool has changed in just a little over 10 years. So one of the things that you can notice, if you look on the far end of the slide, is that back in the 2002, for the 2002-2003 academic year, only about 6% of all the financial aid applicants earned over $150,000. And if you fast forward to the 14-15 academic year, almost 24% of all the applications we received for financial aid were from families earning over $150,000. And on the flip side, if you look on the absolute opposite end of the scale, you'll see how the presence of the lowest income families has been declining as a percentage of all the applications. About 17% or so for families earning under $40,000 and for 14-15, compared with about almost 30% of those families earning under $40,000 apply for aid in 02-03. And so this shift in terms of who is seeking financial aid is very evident and very clear, and it has been sort of shifting this way for quite a while. And one of the things that this is creating within the financial aid sphere in terms of as a trend, there are a couple of things that come to my mind automatically. One is how important it is for people to have the proper perception about what and who a typical financial aid applicant is. It's no longer sort of, if it ever was, it's no longer the very low income, perhaps single parent, inner city, or rural family with very low income who's looking at private schools. It's really shifting towards families who are in an upper sort of scales of the income earners around the country. And that in and of itself creates a second thing that's important to know is, as we get more of those high income families as part of our pool, do we need to be thinking of the way we talk about financial aid differently, the way we develop our policies and practices around what we need to be reviewing and how as those applications perhaps get more complex. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. So it is very clear that one of the key trends in financial aid these days, especially over the last 10 years or a little more, is the shift from middle and low income families in the pool to being more and more upper middle and definitely high income families in the pool. So one of the things that is curious to me about that when I see a stat or some trend lines like that is why might that be happening? Why is that shift occurring? And one of the things that I've sort of come to sort of try to look at is comparing how that demand for financial aid has been growing relative to two things. One is tuition. So as more demand for aid coming in as a sort of consequence of the way tuitions have been increasing, or is it more of a consequence of families feeling more strapped for cash, basically? Are their incomes not growing so fast? Are there more types of other expenses that they're experiencing these days than they did 10 or 20 years ago that are making them feel like their discretionary income is a little bit more stretched? So one of the things I wanted to study and look at was not just looking at tuition change in itself and financial aid change in itself, but how do those things compare to the rate of income change. And so this slide will show you what I think is a very enlightening and a very important sort of pattern to notice. So starting in 1980, I wanted to look at, and that's 1980 is about as far back as I could go with data from NAIS that I have at my fingertips on tuition numbers and data I can get from other sources about income numbers. But if we start in 1980, you can do a couple things. You can kind of peg the rate of growth of this purple line, which represents inflation rate, the consumer price index. So if all the points on this, the starting point of this line is in 1980, it basically shows you sort of like the rate of growth of the consumer price index through 2011 or so. And so what we would know is that if incomes grew at the same rate as inflation, and if tuitions grew at the same rate of inflation, this line would be the same for all the measures that we want to look at. So the first thing I wanted to look at was, well, how has income been changing in that same time frame for this for families? And so this green line shows you the average income for U.S. family households and how that has changed over time since 1980. So one of the things you can see here is that from 1980 through about 1985, 1986 or so, income and inflation rates were growing at about the same rate. And then for the average family, incomes have actually been steadily growing a little bit faster than the rate of inflation overall, generally speaking. So incomes are growing. The mean family, average family income has been growing. Now, one of the things about tuitions and paying for tuitions in independent schools is, at least these days, we know that the average family household, generally speaking, does not earn enough money to pay for the average tuition for an independent school. So I wanted to also look at if a family was expected to be a full-pay family, they'd probably be more than 20%, 15% top income earners. So what's the average income for those people look like was an important thing to look at next. So if I were a family that would be close to full pay or perhaps full pay at many schools, this is how my income has been trending over the same time. The good news here is that, again, for families in the top 20% of income earners, their average income has been growing even faster than the overall families compared to inflation. The next thing I wanted to then look at is, like, well, what about the very most high income earners, the top 5%? What's their income change look like over this same time span? So that's what this red line shows. So if you're in the top 5% of income earners, your average income has grown around in this pace. So this is how income has been changing over time. And again, for most areas, or for most of the first decade or so of this chart, we can see that no matter where you were on the spectrum, your income was growing at about the same rate relative to inflation. Then in about the middle 90s, it started to sort of really separate, with the families at the very top 5% seeing the greatest income change compared to other folks. So this is how people's incomes have been changing over time. The next line I'll show you is how tuitions, the average day tuition, has changed over time as well. And this is where we really start to see where affordability pressure or financial aid demand has come from. So this orange line shows you how tuition change for day students, for day school tuition, has changed over the same time frame. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this orange line, especially relative to the red line, you can see for very much of the time, up until about the early 2000s, the red line is above the orange line, which means families who are able to pay the tuition, if they're in the top 5%, their income was still actually growing faster than, or at a rate that was higher than the way tuitions were growing. But this stopped in about around 2004, 2005 or so. Tuitions kept going up at pretty much the same rate as they always have. That line is pretty steady. But the income growth for families stopped growing as much. So the gap between the orange line, the red line, the blue line, and the green line all started just getting wider and wider for the most part, especially around 2006, 2007, where the incomes for the top 5% became more or less flat and a little bit decreased in the late 2000s. And so one of the things that this suggests to me is that a lot of the extra financial aid demand from high-income families kind of really creeped up on us because tuition growth kept going up at the same rate as it normally does, but income growth for people who could pay it kind of stopped going up as fast or at the same rates. And so it became more difficult for families, whether you were in the top 20% or the top 5%, to keep up with the pace of income, with the pace of tuition change. The same thing was true if you were offering boarding school, for boarding school tuition as well. So this light blue bar shows an even higher rate of change in tuition than the orange day school bar. So the idea here being that the pace of tuition change for a long time was going along around the same speed as the pace of income change. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, that started to shift. People's incomes that didn't go up as much, but tuitions kept going up as much as they always had. And this is one of the things that's creating some of the pressure for families, one of the things creating some of the pressures for more high-income families to be in the financial aid pool, where they may not have been 10 years or 20 years ago. Another way to looking at this is to see sort of exactly how income change is very different today than it used to be in the past few decades. This chart shows you sort of like the average annual income change for people in each of these bands of income earners. So what this blue bar shows you is that in the 1960s, the average income change for a family was about 8% a year, no matter if you were in the lowest quintile of families or if you were even in the top 5% of income earners. All these bars go up to about 8%. So no matter where you were on the economic scale, the amount of your income growth each year was about the same, about 8% or so. In the 1970s, that still held relatively true, although the growth rate was a little lower, so people were seeing more like 7 and 7.5% income growth and not 8. But still, no matter where you were in the spectrum, your income was growing about the same rates on average a year. Then started in the 1980s, that started to change a little bit, and we started to see families on the lower ends of the income scale start to see, or the economic scale, start to see that their incomes weren't growing as fast, big drops, compared to families on the higher ends of the scale, the highest fifth and the top 5%, who actually were still seeing 7 to 8% income growth. In the 1990s, that same pattern repeated itself, but the growth overall was much lower. So families are now seeing 3%, 4%, as much as perhaps even 5.5% on average, but nowhere near the 8% or the 7% that was more common in the 60s and the 70s. And in the 2000s, it was even worse. So, so even people in the top 5% were just seeing about a 2.5% income rate growth, while people on the very low end were seeing about a 1% annual change in income. And so the bottom line is income growth for everyone along the scale fell dramatically. So people's incomes are still growing, which is good news, generally speaking, on average, but not nearly as much as income used to grow. And the challenge for the schools is, as we're setting tuitions at a rate where the tuition growth is consistently 6, 7, sometimes 8%, while families' incomes are growing at a rate that's harder to keep up with that, it's going to create more and more families to seek financial aid and or get sticker shock, and maybe, especially if you're in the lower end of the scale, perhaps find that it's becoming more and more out of reach and you don't even apply for aid or for admission to some degree. So this is one of the, I think one of the dynamics of the dramatic demand shift is just that no matter where you are in the spectrum, incomes just don't grow as fast as they used to be, which makes it harder to keep up with tuition growth. So as a result, one of the things that we find, one of the trends that we find when we're talking about who our applicant pool is that our applicant pool is actually quite much more high income than the population at large. And so the financial aid seekers amongst our applicants basically overrepresent themselves at the higher income bands and underrepresent themselves at the lower income bands. And so it's a real shift in terms of who we think we would expect to apply for aid and who actually does. So to ready to read this chart, the lowest quintile in U.S. households for 2013, I believe these income ranges are for, the 20% of U.S. families that earn the least money in income earn between 0 to 20, about $28,000. And so that's 20% of the U.S. family household population. But they make up only about 10% of the people who apply for financial aid through our SSS service. As opposed to families who earn over $210,000 are in the top 5% of U.S. family income earning households, and they represent 10.5% of people who are seeking financial aid for private school. And so they are twice, they overrepresent themselves by, by a factor of 2, versus the lowest income earning people who underrepresent themselves basically also by kind of a factor of 2, but the reverse, of half. And so one of the things that's interesting about this is that I think it shines a light a little bit or somewhat on the fact that the people who are applying for financial aid are not middle-income families, they're not low-income families. It's really comprised more and more of families in the highest and the next to highest income earning 20% bands of the U.S. population. So if you look at the numbers between the fourth and the fifth highest income quintiles, we get a total of almost 60% of all financial aid applications come from people in the top 40% of income earners. So, and so this helps us kind of see then that the typical financial aid applicant is actually quite a high-ish income earning family. They tend to earn about, or the median income is about $93,000, about $27,000 in net worth, about $15,000 in home equity. Family size is about usually 4, typically 2 parents, 2 children, and they're trying to enroll both of those kids in tuition charging schools, which is what TCS stands for there. Our calculations show that the typical families have to pay about $8,300 towards, or is able to pay $8,300 towards tuition. So this is definitely not the profile of the single parent, low income, high need sort of student that typically sort of gets invoked when people start to think about and talk about financial aid. And so I think it is important to study the trends in who's applying for aid, why those applications are coming in the way they are, and what does that indicate about the affordability of our schools and how we can interact with and learn how to make sure that all families continue to be served well through our financial aid process. It's also important just to be able to address and identify, and in many cases, or in some cases, realign any misperceptions about your financial aid applicants or financial aid recipients at your school if people are making false assumptions and have misperceptions about that. And the data can help you know that. So it's very important to be able to build, a simple profile like this, and many others that can be much more complex, just to be able to show and have good objective facts about who does or who doesn't at least apply for financial aid. Another thing I wanted to kind of talk about quickly here about who the applicants are is a comparison of 2 different surveys, a survey that we did in 2 different years. And one of the sections of the survey was really geared towards trying to figure out how people actually come up with the money to pay their tuition. And so we did a survey we originally did it back in 1986, and then we refreshed it in 2006 and then again in 2013. And so this is just one segment of one of the areas of the survey that talks about or asks people, well, what sources did you use to help pay for your tuition in the past school year? And so there are a few that I wanted to point out because they show a significant enough shift from what people reported in 2006 compared to what they reported, which was pre-recession, and what they reported in 2013, which is post-recession. It was interesting to know that in 2006, about 45% of the families said that they used some kind of withdrawal from their personal savings account to help pay tuition. And it was interesting that that number moved up to 52% of the families saying that they used that in 2013. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about that might be a conclusion to draw, or at least a question to ask is, well, why? Why are more people using their savings in order to help pay for their tuition? And I think that some of it might have had to do with some families, especially coming out of the recession, where their income might have been a little bit, might have been impacted. They were earning less, so they had to dip into their savings to help meet some of their extra costs. Or they were just sort of changing their consumer confidence, sort of changed their ideas of what they should be doing, where cash flow from their income might not be as readily available, or didn't want to sort of jeopardize that, and they may have just sort of wanted to resort to using their savings a little bit larger degree. So that was a big shift, or a significant enough shift to be noteworthy. Another one was gifts from grandparents. So in 2006, 12% of the families told us that they used some help from grandparents to help pay tuition, and that went up to 16% in 2013. So again, might be one of those situations where, and schools talk about this a lot, where they do become aware that grandparents are helping to pay for tuition, how do you look at that? How do you assess that as part of the family's overall resources or not? Do you expect grandparents to also, complete financial aid applications and things like that if it's apparent that they're helping in that way? So having your policies really in tune around, what do we do if we see gifts from grandparents coming in, especially for families who are also receiving financial aid, and how do we acknowledge or accommodate or reconcile that? Because it looks like that's happening a little bit more than it used to. And then the other thing I thought was interesting, big shift, was the people who said, percentage of families who told us that they use home equity loans or a second mortgage to help pay for tuition. It's never been a really high number, so even in 2006 it was only 15% who said they dipped into their home equity to help pay for tuition. But that number cut almost in half, or that percentage cut almost in half to 8% who said that they did so in 2013. And I think that a lot of this does have implications on the post-recession economy, especially right after the recession, where it was more and more difficult for people to even get approved for things like home equity loans. So it's a lot of the credit restrictions and constricting markets that were available to people. So for a lot of folks, it just became a lesser option, even if they had it, to be able to tap into it. So if people are relying less on their home equity loans to help pay for it, relying more on their personal savings, and relying a little bit more on their gifts from grandparents to help out. Also, to have some implications on how schools should be looking at and evaluating those types of financial resources that a family may or may not have as part of their financial picture, financial strength. Now, all those data I just showed you really have more to do with who's applying for financial aid, because it's based on a filing pool, and those are the people that we actually surveyed. And so what we have a little less information about is where are the trends in who's receiving financial aid, because all that data sort of resides at the school end, and we don't get a whole lot of financial aid recipient data other than knowing how many recipients the school might have, but not necessarily what income ranges they fall in, et cetera. So one of the things that we wanted to do is for one of our SSS events in the summer called our Leadership Forum, we gave schools who were attending that forum this exercise to look at families in certain income bands and sort of fill out this chart. And this is actual data from one of the schools from our Leadership Forum last year. And so we wanted to kind of give this as a model, as a template for you to evaluate sort of like the breadth of the economic diversity within your applicant pool, which is what the first column shows. I'm sorry, the second column shows what percentage of your applicants fall into each of these income ranges, and what percentage of your recipients fall into each of these income ranges. And in this school, which was not sort of anomalous, many of the schools that sent us their data showed similar patterns that showed, for many people, what they felt was a counterintuitive result or outcome, which is that the families on the highest end of the scale were the ones most likely to receive a financial aid application, even to a greater proportion or percentage than their percentage as the overall applicants. So when you break your data down this way, you can kind of see a snapshot, and if you do it over 2 or 3 or more years, you can start to see the trend on, when it comes to financial aid, people are asking for it, and who we actually give it to, how close do those numbers really mirror the kind of economic diversity we think that our school is trying to achieve via its financial aid program. So in this particular case, if a school says that their financial aid program is primarily designed to build socioeconomic diversity around all income levels, you can look at this and kind of say, whoa, wait a minute, we're way low on the bottom 2 quintiles and very high on the top 2 quintiles. What should we do? Why is that happening? How can we make some adjustments for that and explore what you can do to be able to correct that change or adjust it or adapt accordingly. I think a large number of this also kind of helps to illuminate, when you look at the very last column, Sample Academy, the average grant that's given to each family in these income quintiles. We can start to also ask some questions about, how well were those awards made? When you look at things like, especially the very top income line, where the average grant is about $14,000, even though the income is over $120,000. So it is important to ask questions like, why is that grant level as high as it is? Is it because those families tend to have, more than one tuition that they're trying to pay for, or other expenses or other things going on that make them qualify for even half or more of the tuition, even at the highest income level? So when you start to look at who our recipient pool is, and looking at that data over time as well, you can really start to ask yourself different questions. Is this how we intended our financial aid distribution to look? Does it serve or address or solve the challenges or the issues for why we created financial aid and why we invested in it in the first place? So I would definitely encourage you to do things like that. And what all these data, all these trends about the applicant pool really shows us, and the recipient pool, is that obviously we're seeing more and more applications, again, mostly driven, I think, largely driven by the fact that tuitions have been growing faster than the income rates for pretty much everybody, even the highest income families. And so it's creating more high income applications. Those applications are usually come through with greater complexity. So you're more likely to see self-employed people or lawyers or partners in firms and all these other things where it requires more time and they become more challenging to actually be able to sift through the documentation and the materials. There's also a lot more pressure to make sure you get it right because boards are concerned about the sustainability of the financial aid investment. Schools are concerned about getting the mix right so that the enrollment goals and using financial aid as an enrollment tool becomes more efficient. And so there's more pressure to make sure that the dollars are going to the right families that solve all those problems, bottom line problems, mission imperatives, and reflective of what your market is telling you. And so there's a lot more pressure on the financial aid administrators to get that right. So as a result, it becomes more and more important as you respond to the trends in the evolving applicant pool to really become better professionals, to really become more skilled and what to ask for from families, how to look at it, how to assess it, and to be able to look to other people in your network when you kind of come across something that stumps you. It's important to have other people lined up to be able to ask questions about it, to be able to get feelers for how other people deal with things like depreciation that a business owner might be showing that you may not necessarily have the best, might not be best equipped to understand what that is and how to use it or not, et cetera, and how to use the tools for that. So it is important to really build more time to review applications because the applications are coming through with greater complexity, more time to be able to become familiar with things like Schedule C for sole proprietorships and business owners, Schedule D for folks who are more invested in the market. They may have a whole lot of capital gains and sale of stocks and things like that, and know where and when you should look at some of that information in detail to learn more about cash flow for those families. More and more likely to see people who own multiple properties, either for rental income or just for vacation and things like that, and how do you actually assess those pieces as part of your financial aid review. So it is important to make sure that you have these trends sort of suggested. It's more and more important to make sure that you have really strong, solid policies around things like self-employment, real estate, equity, debt that people may be reporting and what they're using it for, to really get better at identifying the true cash flow to the household. Because when you're looking at some of these more complex tax forms, it may look might be a little difficult to sort of sift out, well, how much income is really flowing through this household when they report to me that they lost $20,000 in their business, but at the same time they just spent $20,000, on their vacation, family vacation to France or something like that. And so, so it does require more time to do that. It's also important, I think, as a financial aid professional with these evolving trends to really try to stay objective and mindful of your entire applicant pool. As we saw in that previous slide, in one of the previous slides here, as the pressure to sort of fill seats and to stretch your financial aid dollars more towards families who have low needs so that you can get more net tuition revenue from them or fill more seats with the same amount of dollars. If you can spend $20,000 to fill 5 seats that's a better, in some ways that's a better decision than to spend $20,000 to fill one seat. And when you make those types of decisions, it can very quickly end up that your distribution of who's receiving aid at your school can look like this. And if that's your goal, then that's fine. But if it's not your goal and you're not mindful of the entire applicant pool and growing the entire applicant pool across these economic categories, then you might not know until the very end of the process or the result that the result you got may not have been the optimal one you were looking for. And so that means sometimes as you're making individual awards, to always keep in mind what are the needs for the entire pool and how can we best balance those instead of and reconcile that against a proclivity perhaps to just awarding the higher income families because we know we can get a bigger bang for our buck with those. So it is important to just try to keep both your mission and your marketing imperatives in mind around access and affordability. So that's what the trends are sort of showing us around who's applying. The next segment I want to talk about is the trends that we're seeing from the schools end. How are tuitions changing, enrollments changing, financial aid demand changing, and what kind of things do those changes suggest to us as well. So we're going to look at a handful of slides around the data that we're seeing on the school side. And so I kind of approached this by really being curious about, when the recession kicked in, a lot of schools were really worried about, how sustainable were those trends that they were seeing and things that they were having to do differently to respond to the recession. And so one of the things I wanted to kind of study was, well, what were the 5 years before the recession like in terms of tuition change, enrollment change, et cetera? What did the recession period itself look like, and how did that change those items? And then, what does it look like since then? What have schools been doing with those items and those elements and variables since 2010? And so that's what this chart just kind of highlights, a couple of different ways to look at this. So one of the things that I think that's interesting in the tuition side is that prior to the recession, the 5 years prior to the 08-09 school year, the average annual change in tuition, whether you're a day or boarding school, was about 5.5% to 6%. So that was a pretty steady marker that we could see. Schools tended to, in the early 2000s, tended to raise their tuition every year by about 6%, 5.5%. And in the post-recession, one of the things that's been interesting, if you look on the far right of that column, it's interesting to note that since the recession, schools have really become more conservative with their tuition increases. So 4% is much more likely to be a tuition increase in the past 3 or 4 years than the 5.5% or 6% that we were seeing in the earlier part. And so that's good news, that schools have been really good about dialing back the rate of tuition increases, I think to a large degree as a result of the recession effect. And that middle column shows you that for day schools, even in that year following the recession, the hardest part of the recession effect year, they were still raising their tuition about 5% or so, 5.3%. So a little lower than the previous 5-year average, but not significantly lower. As opposed to boarding schools, who really did sort of cut back their tuition growth, and they've raised it a little bit since then. But even so, I think that that's a good trend, that schools are more likely to see 4% tuition changes versus 5.5% or 6% tuition changes. And that in and of itself is a good way to help maintain affordability. And one of the questions is, moving forward, is that possible for schools to maintain? Is it good enough to really try to keep at a 4% sort of marker for tuition change, or perhaps even lower, depending on your community? Now, in the meantime, the last two rows here show what we've seen happen relative to enrollment. And so prior to the recession, which I think for day schools, I think it's a really interesting reality, or interesting observation, is that prior to the recession, the enrollment was pretty flat. Every year, there may have been a little bit of blips here, up and down, a little bit here and there. But for the most part, average enrollment didn't really change much, less than 1% on average per year. And in the recession effect year, it's really interesting that that boosted up to 2%. The median enrollment grew to 2%, and so, or grew by 2%. And so even in the highest part of the recession, effect or the after effect of the recession, people were still enrolling their children in independent schools and day schools in particular. And I think a lot of this has to do with, as we'll see in the next slide, with the way that schools really boosted financial aid to make sure that kids wouldn't have to drop out just because of financial reasons. And in the post-recession, it's kind of gone back to about a 1% average annual growth. The flip side is true with boarding schools. It's interesting that boarding school growth was much more strong than day school growth in those pre-recession years. Recession kicked in, and boarding schools felt a real, on average, the median felt a much greater hit on enrollment, and it still really truly hasn't kind of fully recovered from that quite yet. And so it seems that the boarding school enrollment was much greater, the recession had a much greater effect on the boarding school enrollment than it did on the day school enrollment. So when we look at the financial aid side of this same sort of approach, we can kind of see, here's where we can kind of see the difference between, very stark and clear differences between how financial aid demand was evolving and shaping up prior to the recession and what it's looking like after recession. So financial aid applications tended to grow by about 4.4% a year for schools when the recession hit. And that 1 year from 08-09 to 09-10, schools typically saw a 16.5% increase in who was asking for financial aid. And since then, it's kind of dropped back down closer to the pre-recession average. Now you tend to see about 5.9 or 6% more applications 1 year to the next. So, so even though the application growth in the past 3 or 4 years is not the same growth that we saw in the recession year, it is still a little bit higher than we saw in the early part of the decade. So more and more families are still seeking financial aid, financial aid help from the schools. It's also interesting to see of the people who are applying that the percentage of people who actually show eligibility is also much higher. So not only are you getting more applications, but more of them are also even showing eligibility, which is obviously creating more pressure on the financial aid budget, especially for those families who are accepted and enrolling, to be able to try to help more people. And I think that this is really significant that the need eligible applicants on average, you're seeing about 6% more people showing eligibility in the past 3 or 4 years than the 3% or so who showed eligibility, increase in who's shown eligibility yearly in the early part of the decade. So again, more applications. That's one thing to have more applications, but if, theoretically I have more applications, but, all the extra people are coming in through the pool are not eligible, then it doesn't necessarily have to affect, how much aid I'm pressured to give out. But that's not the case here. We're seeing the growth in applications and the growth of people who are actually eligible to receive some aid. So that's a double whammy there. And as a result, you're seeing a greater increase in the percentage of people that you're actually awarding financial aid. So last 3 or 4 years, the average increase in the number of people receiving financial aid at a typical school is about 5% compared to 2.3% annual increase in that factor before the recession. And during the recession, if you look at this middle column, these were the numbers that were really scaring people and scaring boards. People were worried that they're going to be seeing 16.5% increases in aid applications and 17% increases in recipients from then on, because nobody knew really how long the recessionary effects were going to be. But the data shows us, the recent trend shows us that obviously we've come back to a more normalized sort of level, but the levels that we're seeing today are still higher than they were in 2003 to 2008. Except for the reverse is true, actually interesting, and the amount of financial aid that schools tend to give. So in a pre-recession period, the average increase in the need-based aid that schools gave out was about 10%. In the recession year, the height of that, schools saw a 16% increase in their financial aid awards. And then since the recession, though, the average increase in financial aid granted has been about 9%. So one of the things I think that's interesting here is that even though the percentage of recipients has gone up much higher than the rate that recipients were growing in the pre-recession era or time, the amount of financial aid budget, the amount of financial aid granted is actually less, not the amount granted, the percentage that it increases is less than the way it increases on an annual basis in the pre-recession period. So one of the things that that indicates is that because the, or suggests, I should say, is that because the growth rate is not as high as it used to be, but the dollars that are going to the extra recipients are most likely going to families who have lower need. And the families that really have the highest levels of need are probably less and less likely to be able to get the kind of funding that they really need in order for the school to feel better about the sustainability of the growth of the aid budget. So the aid budgets actually grow a little slower now than they did prior to the recession, which I think is interesting.
Mark, before
so
sorry to interrupt. Mark, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure. Yeah.
Can you go back to that last slide? I just want to clarify something. I think some people might not be sure exactly what the difference between need-eligible applicants and need-based applicants are, because I had someone type in a question about that.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Sure. Need-eligible applicants are really sort of like one of the questions that we ask in our NAS surveys is of all the financial aid applications that you received, how many of them actually show need? Whether or not even if you haven't awarded them, it's just asking how many people actually are eligible to get a grant. Need-based recipients basically says of all the people who actually received aid at your school. Okay, so the applicants aren't necessarily recipients; they're just the people who've applied. You looked at their application, you determined they have need, but for some reason or another, maybe some of them you didn't actually necessarily award. So recipients just shows, I'm sorry, need eligible applicant says, the way I would read this slide is that, you know, in a pre-recession time span, on average, in an average year in that time span, we would see about 3% more people showing that they were eligible for financial aid. And then the next line basically says, you know, in that same time frame, on average every year we were seeing 2.3% more people actually receiving financial aid from us.
Perfect.
So it's a subtle difference, but it's different.
That's perfect. Thank you.
So another way to sort of look at some of these data as well was really looking at the 5-year trends in each of these sort of areas, and then the overall 10-year trend. And I try to juxtapose them against each other to sort of see if there are any patterns or things that emerge. And so I think it's interesting that when you read this slide is on the left side of this we have the day enrollment numbers, for example, and we see in the pre-recession period in that 5-year span, the median day enrollment actually dropped by 5.4%. So in 2008-09, the median day student enrollment was 5% lower than it was in 2003-04. And in the post-recession period, after the recession, from 2009 to 2013, the median enrollment actually went up 3%. So there are 3% more students enrolled in 13-14 than there were enrolled in 2009-2010. But if you look at the overall period, it was relatively flat. Enrollment kind of didn't change too much from 03-04 to 13-14. And if you look at the tuition side, it shows, you know, that in the pre-recession period, tuition, day school median tuition went up in that 5-year span before the recession by about 23%. The 5 years after the recession, about 17%, and overall about 50% growth. So one of the things I think that's interesting when I just look at this visually is how the pre-recession bar for enrollment is negative, and the pre-recession bar for tuition is the highest of the, is higher than the post-recession bar. And the post-recession bar for tuition is lower, and that relates to, or at least visually, it's interesting to see how when the tuition rate slowed, tuition growth slowed, the enrollment growth grew. And so is there, something significant there about causality or correlation between those two things in the post-recession period? Might be interesting for your school to kind of look at and kind of say, oh yeah, how does enrollment and tuition sort of play out here? Do those two, to what degree do those two things go hand in hand So this is just one way of thinking about that. Would us moderating our tuition growth, support or help with our enrollment growth? This slide shows a little bit more about applications and aid eligible applicants. So this shows again a percentage of change and who's applying, or how many applications you receive, and how many of them actually show need. So the thing to me that's interesting about this is that the columns are pretty much the same. So like the post-recession shows a 13% increase in the applications we get, and it shows about a 13% increase in how many people are eligible. So one of the things that these numbers suggest to me is that, especially in the post-recession economy, people weren't just throwing their hat in the ring just to see what happens. And most of the people who are new into the aid application pool were people who really did need help. And it was a little bit less of the case in the pre-recession period, where we tended to see more people not showing, or tended to see less people showing eligibility, less percentage showing eligibility before the recession. And so it is important to be able to kind of say, is that a combination of the recessionary effects on the families themselves, or the way our tuitions are growing faster than than people's incomes is leading more families in the pool to actually show that they do have some need that we have to endeavor to try to meet and build around. And then if you look at the people who actually receive aid, again, you can kind of start to see that the post-recession trend, the 5 years since the recessions ended, that the percentage of families who receive financial aid is about 8% greater than it was at the beginning of the post-recession period, compared to a 15% change in the pre-recession period. So we're a little bit less likely to give financial aid to a need-based, to a person who's showing financial need than we did in the pre-recession period. And some of that might be, again, a reflection of schools being skittish about the sustainability of their financial aid growth. And as a result, if you look at the green bars, we can see need-based aid dollars grew by 30% in the post-recession period, where they grew by almost 60% in the pre-recession period. So it suggests that in the last 4 or 5 years, the schools have been wanting to sort of ratchet back a little bit on how deeply or broadly that they were using the financial aid or spending the financial aid dollars. And in many schools, I do know, just by talking with boards and talking with financial aid leaders, et cetera, that a lot of that really was driven by many schools by mandates from the board to cap, the percentage of aid, or to cap the amount of dollars that a school would sort of devote to that as a sustainability, primarily as a sustainability measure. So that's an important trend to keep watching as well. So real quick, I know I've only got a few minutes here left, so I apologize I'm going a little bit longer than I thought I would, but I think it also is important to kind of say, okay, if that's what the past trends show, what does that mean in terms of the future of affordability and where tuitions are going from here, and what is going to be required for families to be able to keep up with those tuition costs and for it to stay affordable. So I kind of just did a real pedestrian kind of projection of that. So I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of what this might look like. So for day tuitions in 2013-14, the median day school tuition was about $22,000. So if that tuition grew at the same rate as our pre-recession average, about 5.5%, in 10 years that tuition is going to be $37,000. If we were able to commit to the rate of growth that we've been seeing in the past 5 years, about 4%, then that tuition in 10 years is going to be about $33,000. Now, at face value, that might not sound like a lot of money, but for a school to be about $5,000 more affordable to somebody 10 years from now, if we could keep our current 4.2% tuition growth rate, that'll help tremendously from a family's perspective, and just give you a greater pool of families who are actually able to meet that. So this chart shows you, I'm just looking at a few different data points, how much income a family would need to earn to be able to pay each of those tuition points. So right now, to pay $21,715, the family needs to earn about $155,000. Census data shows us that there are about 12% of the families in the U.S. actually earn that much. If you move up to about the 4% projection rate, to be able to pay that $33,000 tuition, a family would need to earn about $197,000. Right now, there are about 6% of the households who actually earn that much. And then if you hit that $37,000 figure, a family would need $212,000 to earn that, and right now they're only about 5%. So obviously, as the income as the tuition increases, income needed to pay it increases, and the percentage of people in the population who could pay that is likely to shrink. Obviously, it's hard to predict how much income is going to change between now and 5 years from now or 10 years from now. But it is important to have some kind of markers that kind of says, you know what, if our tuition is going to grow by 50 or 51% in the next 10 years, that's going to require people who are full pay, it's going to require them to have a 26% increase in their income. And our past trends show us, the very first slide I showed you, that that's unlikely to happen. And if that's unlikely to happen, then that means increasing pressure in financial aid and budgeting for increased applications and increased eligible applicants, as we've been seeing. It's been a trend in the last 5 years, for sure. It's something that's going to probably continue. We need to have some kind of markers for thinking about how we deal with that. Same trend is sort of apparent in the boarding schools. If you're at a boarding school, so I won't go through the slide here, but I'll at least show you the numbers. So again, if we can keep our tuition growth moderated at where we have been recently or even lower, it's just going to increase our chances of making sure that our schools are more affordable to families, putting less pressure on our financial aid dollars and our financial aid budgets. I'm going to probably go through this one really quickly because I only got a couple minutes left. I want to make sure we leave some time for questions. But one of the things that I think is interesting is that a lot of schools over time have talked about how worried they are that when their tuition hits a certain break point, a certain milestone measure, that people will maybe push back and stop paying the tuition, and enrollments might dip because we crossed some magic threshold of some number. And I've always kind of contended that it's not the number, the tuition might be more of a barrier for people who are seeking independent schools and maybe not knowing enough about the financial aid option that might keep them out. But once a family is in, the rate of growth becomes more important than the actual price point. And since most of the people in our schools are seeking financial aid, are going to be returning students, it's really more the issue of how are we managing the rate of change for tuition. So for example, back in 1986 or so was the first time that tuitions for day schools crossed the $5,000 threshold. In 1997, 98 was the first time it crossed the $10,000 threshold. 2005 was the first time it crossed 15,000, and in 2011 was the first time it crossed 20,000. So if we looked at what happened to enrollment at the same time, median enrollment when it hit 5,000 was 297. When it crossed 10,000, it was 347. So much higher number. Even though we crossed that threshold, it didn't really affect enrollment. We crossed 15,000, and enrollment is still growing, 371. And when we crossed $20,000, which I think is interesting, it didn't grow so much. Only four additional students. And actually, in about 2007 or so, 2008, the median enrollment was actually as low as 354 students. And so here, if you look at these lines relative to these tuition markers relative to the gaps in tuition growth versus income growth, the red, the dark blue, the green lines in particular, it seems like to me that the enrollment slows down when that gap gets wider. It's not the price point itself that was necessarily the problem or a problem, but the fact that when the incomes were rising at about the same rate as tuitions, then enrollment was growing. When tuition started to really truly outpace income growth, then enrollment sort of slows. And so that's, I think, is an important thing to try to keep in mind as we talk about managing our affordability. It's not just how do we fund more financial aid, and how do we deliver financial aid differently. A lot of it, I think, has to do with how do we control the rate of tuition increases from year to year. Boarding schools, this chart shows the boarding schools showed a very similar sort of pattern. So in 1991, I picked, it says 16,000. I was looking for the year where boarding school tuition first crossed 15,000, but it actually skipped the 15,000s altogether. It went from like 14,8 something all the way up to 16,44 in 1 year. But at the same time, we can kind of see where enrollment started to sort of flatten was when the gaps between tuition growth, the orange line here, and income growth, the red and the blue and the green, got wider. So the pace of change is just as important as the price point itself. And so it's a good thing that tuition growth is happening more slowly the past 4 or 5 years than it did in the early part of the decade, because I think that is a key thing for affordability. It's not just how we manage financial aid discounts better, but how we manage our tuition growth more moderately. Again, so this slide just shows you sort of like a summary of what our recent trends are showing us. But I think it does suggest that one of the trends that we're seeing is that schools are continuing to shift their financial aid dollars towards lower need, higher income families, whether it's because they changed the purpose of what they think their financial aid should bring for the school, or if it's because their market's changing. Maybe there are more high income families in your market than there used to be, et cetera. You know, is it because boards and others at the schools are more concerned about the bottom line sustainability, so we want to keep a lid on that, and the best way to keep a lid on that is to stop giving basically really high awards to fewer students. Are more and more lower middle income families even not getting in the pool because of the sticker shock that they're seeing, the way the tuitions are growing, that they're not even able to sort of keep up, so they don't even get into the mix as much? Or is it that even for upper and higher income families who might be able to afford the tuitions, are they questioning the value of that? So they're seeking financial aid to bring that cost down to a point that they feel might be of a more value-added price point. So here are the kinds of questions we think a lot of these trends sort of force you to ask, or at least should be on the table of some of your conversations at the leadership level with your financial aid committee, with your head, with your board or board committee. You know, what are these trends? How can you study similar types of things at your own school to see what those trends in the demographics, income change, et cetera, tell you about the future of affordability? What would those, if you stayed on your current trajectories, map out about 10 years from now, like what would that look like? What would our tuition look like? What would incomes likely look like? And how does that affect the demand for financial aid? You know, I think this is also a good time to look at some of these data to kind of reaffirm what the core purpose of our financial aid investment is. You know, is it different today than it was 10 years ago or 5 years ago? What do we think that how we need to use financial aid to draw students through our admissions funnel, or is the mission-based imperative a little bit changed? What needs to be in place to increase your financial aid investment in admission-ready higher need students? This is where the area where we have seen that people are losing out. Low-income, higher need students, especially new students, are becoming less and less likely to receive the kind of aid that they need compared to 10 years ago and 15 and 20 years ago. And what do we need to do to get back to that if part of our goal is to have very broad economic diversity and to offer access and opportunity to students who really need them and who can thrive in our schools, because we seem to be eroding, that seems to be eroding in many places. And then what kind of communication and fundraising efforts do we need to have in order to raise the funds to make all that stuff possible? If we can envision what our key purpose is and what our perceived future is for developing an economically diverse class and community, you know, excuse me, what do we actually need to do to make sure we have the resources for that and communicate the value of that to all of our stakeholders? So these are a handful of steps that we think are important for you to think about and to try to engage in. Have conversations at the leadership level, with the head, the board, et cetera, and other stakeholders on, are we all on the same page about what we want financial aid to get us? You know, what's the goal and purpose for our aid program? It's important for everybody to be on the same, to have the same idea of what that means, so that appropriate resources and policies can really be in place to help everybody help the school move along in that area. Definitely look at the resources that you have at your fingertips. Pretty much all the data that I showed you were data I could crunch through the SSS school portal, through our DAZZLE program, the NAS DAZZLE, give you good trend data on your school and other groups of schools. Demographic Center give you good data on things like income distribution within communities and zip codes, et cetera. So you can kind of get a feel for what do things look like now and how are they changing over time. Look at the relationship between tuition change, financial aid demand, and your admissions funnel. When people drop out of your admissions funnel, to what degree is that based on sticker shock or price reactions, whether or not they thought they would or wouldn't qualify for financial aid or did not get financial aid, and try to figure out at what points are people dropping out relative to affordability concerns that we can do something about so that we can keep that funnel nice and strong. Identify and address both the internal and external factors that impact your ability to meet your imperatives for economic diversity. If those things matter to you, if economic diversity matters to you as a school, getting the kids the best kids possible from no matter where they come from, you really have to identify what are the obstacles to that, and be able to say, if we have these three challenges to making sure we have a diverse pool of students economically, then how can we align ourselves, our resources, and our tools to overcome them? It's very important to really be very explicit about those things, and they can be very different from different schools. But a lot of the trends suggest that if we don't get control over what we think are the things that are keeping us from achieving that goal are not true or are true, then we can really act very purposefully around that. And lastly, you can use the board. A lot of schools are starting to do this over the past few years, but convening a board-level task force, affordability or tuition, financial aid group, whatever you want to call it, to guide this kind of examination would be very, 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 very helpful. So it can raise to a board-level kind of conversation that kind of says, here's what we want as a board in terms of our economic diversity goals or our financial aid goals, and what we expect that to build for us. And when a board kind of sets that stake in the sand, then you can sort of rally around that to decide, or to examine and discern what you need to have in place in order to get there, and where you are already succeeding and where you're falling short, where board commitment, both in terms of financial resources, policy directives, et cetera, can really help make sure you're guiding your program in the right direction. So with that, I'm going to stop. I know I've gone beyond time. I hope that if you do have another minute or two to stay on, I'm happy to do that if we do have some questions that are out there. So Corinne, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Mark. That has been so eye-opening, and I think the incredible last few slides with the strategic questions and action steps for many of us in enrollment managers to take to our boards and work with our heads of school on to think about what our next steps are as we do our enrollment planning. I think they'll be very, very useful for a lot of people. We don't have any questions beyond the ones that I kind of stepped in and asked about today. So it was perfect, the amount of time you filled, and we had people staying with us, and I think we're very interested in all of the data that you provided. It was an incredible resource to a lot of us. I know enrollment people, as you go to boards and get ready for your upcoming January onslaught of applicants. So I want to thank you all for tuning in and staying with us, and a special thanks to Mark Mitchell for providing this incredible data and resource to us today. And as a reminder, if you'd like to refer back, a recording of this presentation will be available on the professional development section of the admission.org website. Thank you all again, and have a great day. Absolutely.
Corinne, can I mention one other thing? So I'm happy to send this presentation to you if you want to distribute it to the folks who registered for the webinar. That's absolutely no problem.
That's great. And again, if it will be something that we can actually have as a recording as well online. So if anyone would like that, they can be in touch, and we will be happy to make that available as well. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.